Psalm 3, a psalm of David, when he fled from Absalom his son. A psalm of David, when he fled from Absalom his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people, who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. Analysis and explanation. Psalm 3 is a personal lament and a prayer for deliverance composed by David during one of the most harrowing periods of his life. His flight from Absalom, his son, who led a rebellion against him. 2 Samuel 15-18. This psalm provides a window into David's heart during a time of deep distress, fear, and uncertainty. It demonstrates his faith in God's protection and sovereignty despite overwhelming adversity. Structurally, the psalm moves from complaint to confidence, petition, and ultimately, to praise. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. David begins by voicing his distress. The repetition of many emphasizes the sheer magnitude of his opposition. His enemies are not just numerous. They are actively rising against him, indicating an escalating threat. The phrase, many are saying of my soul, reveals the nature of the attack. It is not just physical but spiritual and emotional. His adversaries claim that David is beyond God's help, a statement aimed at undermining his faith and hope. The phrase, there is no salvation for him in God, is particularly cutting. It challenges the very foundation of David's trust in God, suggesting that his sins or failures, possibly referencing his past transgressions, such as his sin with Bathsheba, have disqualified him from God's deliverance. This accusation echoes the tactics of spiritual warfare, where doubt is sown about God's faithfulness and ability to save. The inclusion of Selah invites a pause, encouraging the reader or singer to reflect deeply on the weight of these accusations and the gravity of David's situation. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. The psalm shifts from despair to a confident declaration of faith. The conjunction but marks a turning point, as David contrasts the claims of his enemies with the reality of God's character and promises. Despite the multitude of foes, David proclaims three truths about God. 1. A shield about me. Unlike a regular shield that protects only the front, God is described as a shield that surrounds David completely. This metaphor underscores God's comprehensive protection, guarding him from all sides, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. 2. My glory. While David's earthly glory as king was tarnished by Absalom's rebellion, he acknowledges that his true glory comes from God. This reflects a deep humility and understanding that his worth and honor are rooted not in his position but in his relationship with God. 3. The lifter of my head. In times of shame or defeat, one's head is often bowed in despair. God is depicted as the one who restores dignity and confidence, lifting David's head in hope and reassurance. This imagery conveys a profound sense of God's care and encouragement, even in the midst of humiliation. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. David recalls a specific instance of calling out to God and receiving an answer. The phrase cried aloud indicates fervent, vocal prayer, a raw and honest outpouring of his heart. This reflects David's unshakable belief in the accessibility and responsiveness of God, even during times of crisis. The reference to his holy hill likely alludes to Mount Zion, where the Ark of the Covenant, representing God's presence, was kept. Though David is physically distant from Jerusalem during his flight, he affirms that God's presence and power are not limited by geography. This acknowledgement of God's sovereignty and transcendence reinforces David's confidence in prayer. The second, Selah, provides another pause, inviting reflection on the assurance that God hears and responds to the cries of his people. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. David now reflects on God's sustaining power. The act of laying down and sleeping in the midst of such turmoil is a profound demonstration of trust. Sleep, often elusive in times of anxiety, becomes a gift from God, a tangible reminder of his provision and care. The fact that David woke again points to God's faithfulness in preserving his life through the night, a time of vulnerability. This verse encapsulates a simple yet profound truth. God's sovereignty extends to every moment, providing both physical and spiritual sustenance. David's ability to rest highlights the peace that comes from entrusting one's life to God. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Building on the assurance of God's protection, David boldly declares his freedom from fear. The phrase, many thousands, emphasizes the overwhelming odds against him, yet his confidence is unshaken. The use of all around evokes a sense of encirclement, a position of extreme vulnerability. However, David's trust in God transforms this dire situation into one of assurance and courage. This verse reflects the heart of biblical faith, a trust in God that transcends circumstances. David's courage is not rooted in his own strength or strategy but in the knowledge that God is his shield. Arise, O Lord! Save me, O my God! For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. David now moves into a petition for deliverance, calling upon God to arise. This language echoes the cry of the Israelites in Numbers 10:35, where Moses would pray for God to rise up and scatter his enemies as the Ark of the Covenant set out. It is a call for God to act decisively on behalf of his anointed. The imagery of striking enemies on the cheek and breaking their teeth is vivid and symbolic. Striking the cheek represents humiliation and defeat, while breaking the teeth of the wicked suggests disarming their ability to harm. The teeth, often associated with predatory power, are rendered useless, emphasizing God's ability to completely neutralize his foes. This verse reinforces the theme that ultimate victory belongs to God. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. The psalm concludes with a profound theological affirmation. Salvation is the exclusive domain of God. The word salvation, Yeshua, carries the dual meaning of physical deliverance and spiritual redemption. David acknowledges that his rescue, whether from immediate danger or ultimate judgment, comes solely from God's hand. The final line extends the scope of David's prayer beyond his personal situation to encompass the broader community of God's people. By invoking God's blessing on his people, David demonstrates a shepherd's heart, prioritizing the well-being of the nation over his own struggles. The concluding Selah invites the reader to meditate on this truth, that God is both the source of salvation and the provider of blessing for his people. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. David's opening cry establishes the gravity of his situation. His repeated use of many highlights the overwhelming number of adversaries. These are not merely political enemies or foreign powers. They include members of his own kingdom, even his own family, as the context of Absalom's rebellion indicates. This multitude symbolizes not just physical threats but spiritual and emotional distress, as David feels isolated and outnumbered. The phrase, many are rising against me, suggests an active and coordinated uprising. This is a direct attack on David's kingship, which was established by God's covenant with him. 2 Samuel 7 verses 12 to 16. The rebellion challenges not only David's authority but also the legitimacy of God's promises. The opposition is fueled by a collective belief that David is forsaken, a belief expressed in their taunts. There is no salvation for him in God. This statement, there is no salvation for him in God, cuts deeply. The Hebrew word for salvation, Yeshua, refers to deliverance, rescue, or victory, and the adversaries are essentially declaring that David's sin or situation has rendered him beyond God's help. Their claim is not just a denial of David's kingship but an affront to God's faithfulness. This accusation could also reflect David's inner fears, as he may wrestle with doubts about whether his past sins, such as his actions with Bathsheba and Uriah, have severed his relationship with God. The Selah at the end of this verse serves as a pause, urging the reader or singer to reflect on the weight of this crisis. It invites contemplation of the tension between human accusation and divine reality, between the apparent hopelessness of David's situation and the yet-to-be-revealed intervention of God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. This verse marks a dramatic shift from despair to trust. The phrase, but you, introduces a strong contrast, as David turns his focus from the overwhelming number of enemies to the character and promises of God. The personal address, O Lord, reinforces the intimate relationship David has with God, even in the midst of adversity. The metaphor of a shield, magen, is deeply significant. In ancient warfare, a shield provided protection against physical attacks, but David expands this imagery by describing God as a shield about me, implying total and encompassing protection. This goes beyond a physical defense, emphasizing that God's protection surrounds him on all sides, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. David calls God my glory, a remarkable statement given his current circumstances. His earthly glory as king has been stripped away by Absalom's rebellion, but David acknowledges that his true glory comes from his relationship with God. This reflects a profound humility and a recognition that human achievements and titles are secondary to the honor of being God's chosen servant. The phrase, "the lifter of my head," carries rich emotional and spiritual connotations. In times of defeat or shame, one's head is often bowed low. By calling God the lifter of his head, David acknowledges that God restores his dignity, confidence, and hope. This lifting of the head is not merely a physical act but a declaration of God's power to renew and vindicate his servant. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. David recalls an act of prayer, emphasizing that he cried aloud, kor, to the Lord. This vocal outpouring of his heart signifies desperation and urgency. David does not rely on silent meditation. He actively calls upon God, demonstrating a faith that seeks and expects a response. The phrase, "and he answered me," reflects David's confidence in God's responsiveness. Despite his circumstances, David trusts in God's willingness to engage with him. This is particularly significant given that David is physically distant from Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence. The mention of his holy hill, referring to Mount Zion, reaffirms that God's power and sovereignty are not limited by geography. The holy hill symbolizes God's dwelling place and the center of his reign, assuring David that divine authority remains intact despite the upheaval in his life. The Selah invites reflection on the power of prayer and the assurance of God's presence. It encourages readers to consider the faithfulness of God in responding to his people, even when circumstances seem dire. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. This verse captures the simplicity and profundity of trust in God. Sleep, often elusive during times of anxiety or danger, becomes an act of faith. For David to lay down and sleep in the midst of his peril reflects his complete reliance on God's protection. The ability to rest signifies a peace that transcends his external circumstances, rooted in the knowledge that God is in control. The phrase, "I woke again," highlights God's sustaining power. Each new day is a testament to God's faithfulness, as he preserves David's life through the night. This statement acknowledges the fragility of human existence and the constant need for divine sustenance. It also contrasts sharply with the enemies who claim that there is no salvation for David in God. By waking, David experiences a tangible reminder that God has not abandoned him. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. David's declaration of fearlessness is striking, given the overwhelming odds against him. The many thousands of people evoke an image of complete encirclement, a situation that would naturally provoke terror. Yet David's confidence is unwavering. His fearlessness is not rooted in his own strength or military strategy, but in his trust in God's protection. The phrase, "set themselves against me," recalls the earlier description of his enemies rising against him. This repetition reinforces the seriousness of the threat while also highlighting the contrast between the intentions of his adversaries and the security David finds in God. Arise, O Lord. Save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. David calls upon God to arise, echoing the battle cry of Israel in Numbers 10:35, where Moses prayed for God to scatter his enemies. This invocation reflects a plea for divine intervention, asking God to act decisively on his behalf. The imagery of striking enemies on the cheek and breaking their teeth is both vivid and symbolic. To strike the cheek represents humiliation and defeat, reducing the enemies to a state of shame. Breaking the teeth of the wicked suggests disarming them, rendering them powerless to harm. The teeth, often associated with predatory strength, symbolize the ability to cause pain and destruction. By breaking their teeth, God neutralizes their capacity for harm, showcasing his sovereignty over even the most dangerous foes. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. The psalm concludes with a profound theological declaration. Salvation is entirely the domain of God. This statement encapsulates David's faith, acknowledging that deliverance, whether from physical enemies or spiritual peril, comes solely from the Lord. The final line shifts from David's personal plight to a broader focus on the community of God's people. By invoking God's blessing on his people, David demonstrates a shepherd's heart, prioritizing the well-being of the nation over his personal struggles. This communal aspect reinforces the idea that God's sovereignty and salvation extend to all who trust in him. The closing Selah serves as a final pause for meditation, encouraging readers to reflect on the truths of God's protection, justice, and sovereignty revealed throughout the psalm. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. David begins by laying bare the reality of his situation. He is surrounded by enemies. The repetition of many intensifies the sense of overwhelming opposition. This is not merely a factual observation. It is an expression of emotional and spiritual weight. The multitude of adversaries symbolizes the external pressures and internal turmoil that accompany his flight from Absalom. The enemy's assertion, there is no salvation for him in God, is particularly cutting. In Hebrew, the word salvation, Yeshua, carries connotations of rescue, deliverance, and safety. This claim is more than a statement of doubt about David's political future. It is a spiritual attack aiming to erode his faith. It suggests that David's sins or failures have rendered him beyond redemption, implying that God's covenant faithfulness has been withdrawn. This accusation reflects a profound misunderstanding of God's nature. It assumes that human failure can nullify divine promises. For David, this is a direct challenge to his identity as God's chosen king, an identity rooted in God's covenant with him. Yet, the inclusion of Selah invites reflection, creating space for the reader to consider the weight of these words and to anticipate David's response of faith. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. This verse begins with a stark contrast. But you, the adversaries have spoken, but David now turns to the Lord, countering their claims with the reality of God's character and promises. The address, O Lord, Yahweh, emphasizes God's covenantal relationship with David, a reminder of God's unchanging faithfulness. The metaphor of a shield, Magen, is rich in meaning. In ancient warfare, shields were essential for protection, but the phrase, a shield about me, suggests something far greater than a typical defensive tool. It signifies complete and encompassing protection, guarding every aspect of David's life, his physical safety, emotional well-being, and spiritual integrity. This imagery conveys God's active role as a defender who surrounds and safeguards his people. My glory, Kavodi, shifts the focus to God as the source of David's honor and worth. In human terms, David's glory, his kingship, reputation, and authority, has been stripped away. Yet he acknowledges that his true glory is not rooted in earthly status but in his relationship with God. This declaration is a profound act of faith, affirming that his ultimate identity and value remain secure in God, even amidst apparent defeat. The phrase, the lifter of my head, evokes a deeply personal image. In times of shame or despair, one's head is bowed. To have one's head lifted signifies restoration, dignity, and hope. God is depicted as tenderly intervening, lifting David from his place of despair and restoring his confidence. This act is not just emotional encouragement. It is a divine affirmation of David's place as God's chosen servant. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. David recalls a specific moment of prayer, emphasizing that he cried aloud to the Lord. The Hebrew verb, kara, implies a vocal and urgent plea, reflecting the intensity of his situation. This act of calling upon God demonstrates David's deep reliance on him, even in a time when circumstances might suggest abandonment. The response comes from his holy hill, a reference to Zion, where the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, was located. Though David is far from Jerusalem, this statement affirms that God's power and authority are not confined to a physical location. The mention of the holy hill underscores the unchanging nature of God's rule and his ability to intervene regardless of David's geographical or emotional distance. The Selah here encourages the reader to pause and meditate on the power of prayer and the assurance that God hears and responds. It invites reflection on the relationship between human supplication and divine intervention. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. This verse captures a moment of profound trust. Sleep, often elusive in times of stress and danger, becomes a tangible expression of faith. For David to lay down and sleep while surrounded by enemies demonstrates his absolute reliance on God's protection. The act of waking again is not taken for granted. It is attributed to God's sustaining power. The verb sustained, samak, conveys the idea of being upheld or supported. This acknowledges God's active role in preserving David's life, even in the most vulnerable moments. Each new morning becomes a testimony to God's faithfulness, a reminder that He is the one who holds David's life in His hands. This verse also reflects the Psalm's broader theme of divine provision. While the enemies seek to instill fear and doubt, David's ability to rest highlights the peace that comes from trusting in God's sovereignty. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. David declares his resolve to remain fearless, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The many thousands of people represent an insurmountable human threat, yet David's trust in God renders this numerical superiority meaningless. His confidence is not based on his own strength or strategy but on the assurance of God's protection. The phrase, "set themselves against me all around," evokes a vivid image of encirclement. This would naturally be a position of vulnerability and despair, yet David's faith transforms it into an opportunity to proclaim God's sufficiency. This declaration of fearlessness is a testament to the transformative power of faith, which enables believers to face seemingly impossible situations with courage and peace. Arise, O Lord! Save me, O my God! For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. David calls upon God to arise, a phrase often associated with divine action and intervention, e.g., Numbers 10:35. This cry is both a plea and a declaration of faith, expressing confidence that God will act on his behalf. The imagery of striking enemies on the cheek conveys humiliation and defeat. In ancient culture, a slap to the cheek was a gesture of disgrace, symbolizing the shaming and subjugation of one's adversaries. The breaking of the teeth of the wicked is a powerful metaphor, signifying the removal of their ability to harm. Teeth, associated with predatory aggression, are rendered useless, illustrating God's ability to completely neutralize his enemies. This verse reflects the justice of God, who not only protects his people but also actively works to dismantle the plans and power of the wicked. It reinforces the theme of divine sovereignty, highlighting that ultimate victory belongs to the Lord. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. The psalm concludes with a declaration of God's exclusive authority over salvation. The Hebrew word for salvation, Yeshua, emphasizes that deliverance is entirely God's domain, whether it involves physical rescue or spiritual redemption. David's assertion counters the enemy's claim that there is no salvation for him in God, reaffirming that God alone determines the fate of his servants. The extension of the blessing to your people shifts the focus from David's personal plight to the broader community of faith. This communal dimension underscores David's role as a shepherd king who seeks the welfare of God's people, even in the midst of his own trials. The final Selah invites the reader to meditate on the nature of God's salvation and his blessing, encouraging a deeper trust in his sovereignty and grace. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. David's cry begins with an exclamation of astonishment and despair. The opening, O Lord, Yahweh, immediately sets the tone of dependence and desperation, calling upon the covenant name of God, which emphasizes his faithfulness and relational nature. This invocation anchors the psalm in David's unwavering belief in God's presence and power, even as he confronts a seemingly insurmountable crisis. The repeated use of many, rabbim, amplifies the scope of David's plight. The term reflects not just the quantity of his adversaries but also the intensity of their opposition. This is a collective rebellion, likely reflective of the specific historical context of Absalom's insurrection, which drew significant portions of the nation against David. However, the language transcends this particular situation, speaking to the universal experience of feeling overwhelmed by external pressures. The phrase, "many are rising against me," malai, conveys a dynamic, active threat. This is not a static situation. The danger is escalating, with enemies gathering momentum and strength. The word rising evokes the image of a tide surging higher, threatening to engulf David completely. This imagery captures the compounded fear and urgency of the moment. The attack against David intensifies as it shifts from physical threats to spiritual ones. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. The term soul, nafshi, here refers to David's innermost being, the core of his identity and relationship with God. His adversaries not only challenge his kingship but also his standing before God. They claim that David is beyond redemption, cut off from divine favor due to his sins and failures. This accusation strikes at the heart of David's faith. It is not merely a denial of God's ability to save but a direct attack on God's willingness to intervene on David's behalf. The suggestion that there is no salvation for him in God echoes the voice of the accuser in Job's story, where the enemy seeks to undermine trust in God's faithfulness. It is a spiritual assault designed to sow doubt and despair. The insertion of Selah invites the reader to pause and reflect deeply on the weight of these accusations. It creates space to consider the tension between human condemnation and divine faithfulness, setting the stage for the dramatic shift in David's response. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. The psalm pivots sharply with the phrase, "But you, O Lord." This marks a decisive turn from despair to confidence, as David shifts his focus from the overwhelming opposition of his enemies to the unchanging nature of God. The conjunction "but, viata" introduces a powerful contrast, underscoring that God's character and promises remain steadfast, regardless of external circumstances. The metaphor of a shield, magen, is central to this verse. In ancient warfare, a shield was a vital defensive tool, protecting a soldier from enemy attacks. However, David describes God not merely as a shield but as a shield about me, Badi, signifying total and encompassing protection. This imagery conveys the idea that God's protection is holistic, guarding David from all sides, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The use of this metaphor also highlights David's vulnerability, as he acknowledges his dependence on God's safeguarding presence. My glory, kavodi, is a striking declaration. David's earthly glory, his position as king, his reputation, and his honor, has been stripped away by the rebellion. Yet he affirms that his true glory is not tied to his circumstances or achievements but is found in God alone. This statement reflects profound humility and a recognition that God is the ultimate source of honor and worth. The phrase, "the lifter of my head," Yumarim Rashi, evokes a deeply personal and intimate image. To lift someone's head is an act of encouragement and restoration, often performed by a superior to affirm their dignity and worth. In the context of David's humiliation and defeat, this imagery conveys God's power to restore and vindicate him. It is a reminder that, even in the lowest moments, God is actively working to renew and uplift his servants. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. David recalls an act of prayer, emphasizing both its fervency and its effectiveness. The phrase, "I cried aloud," Koli El Yahweh Ekra, conveys a sense of urgency and intensity. This is not a quiet or passive prayer but a desperate plea from the depths of David's soul. His willingness to cry out aloud reflects his confidence in God's accessibility and willingness to hear. The response comes from his holy hill, Mihar Kadsho, a reference to Mount Zion, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. This phrase emphasizes God's sovereignty and his abiding presence among his people. Despite David's physical distance from Zion during his flight, he affirms that God's power and authority are not limited by geography. The holy hill represents the seat of God's rule and the assurance that his purposes will prevail. The inclusion of Selah again invites reflection. It encourages the reader to meditate on the relationship between prayer and divine response, highlighting the accessibility of God and the confidence that his servants can have in calling upon him. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. This verse captures a moment of profound trust in God's provision. The act of laying down and sleeping, particularly in the context of David's flight, reflects a deep reliance on God's protection. Sleep, often impossible in times of anxiety or danger, becomes a tangible expression of faith. For David to rest in the midst of such turmoil is a declaration that he entrusts his life entirely to God. The statement, "I woke again," is significant. It acknowledges that each new day is a gift from God, a reminder of his sustaining power. The verb sustained, samak, implies active support and upholding, emphasizing God's role as the one who preserves David's life. This verse encapsulates the peace that comes from entrusting oneself to God's care, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. David's declaration of fearlessness is striking. The mention of many thousands, Rivatam, underscores the magnitude of the threat he faces, yet his confidence remains unshaken. This courage is not rooted in personal strength or strategy, but in the knowledge that God is his shield and sustainer. The phrase, "set themselves against me all around," evokes an image of encirclement, a situation that would naturally provoke fear and despair. Yet David's trust in God transforms this scenario into an opportunity to declare God's sufficiency. His confidence reflects the transformative power of faith, which enables believers to face even the most daunting challenges with courage. Arise, O Lord. Save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. David calls upon God to arise, echoing the language of Numbers 10:35, where Moses would pray for God to scatter his enemies. This cry is both a plea for deliverance and a declaration of faith, expressing confidence that God will act on his behalf. The imagery of striking enemies on the cheek and breaking their teeth is vivid and symbolic. Striking the cheek signifies humiliation and defeat, while breaking the teeth of the wicked represents the neutralization of their power to harm. Teeth, often associated with predatory aggression, are rendered useless, highlighting God's ability to dismantle the plans and strength of his enemies completely. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. The psalm concludes with a powerful affirmation of God's sovereignty over salvation. The declaration "salvation belongs to the Lord," Yahweh Heshwah, underscores that deliverance, whether physical or spiritual, is entirely the work of God. It is a direct counter to the enemy's claim that there is no salvation for David in God. The final line extends the focus beyond David's personal plight to encompass the entire community of God's people. By invoking God's blessing on his people, David demonstrates his concern for their welfare and acknowledges that his deliverance is part of God's broader redemptive plan. The closing Selah invites the reader to meditate on this truth, reinforcing the psalm's central message of trust in God's sovereignty and care.